the corrosion industry is proud to have you here. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Nick Xenophon.
Who would have thought in my political career I'd be introduced by Muhammad Ali? The original Muhammad Ali, because when Cassius Clay was still Cassius Clay, he was actually Muhammad Ali. So there you go. So thank you very much, Muhammad, for that welcome, and thank you for inviting me to speak today at your conference. I've got a confession to make. If I'm working on a talk such as this, I like listening to some music. Now, Paul Keating used to famously listen to that classical composer Mahler. Obviously, I'm nowhere in Keating's league. I wear $99 suits, not Zegna suits. But I need to tell you, for inspiration for today, I dug up my vinyl copy of the only thing I could listen to, which was Neil Young's album Rust Never Sleeps. Although I'm not quite sure what talking lyrics about Johnny Rotten and it's better to burn out than to rust is relevant to your conference. Now, I always feel a bit nervous when I'm asked to speak to a group that are far more expert than I am. I'm always worried that I'll say something or a lot of some things that shows you how little I know about a particular topic. So I'd like to start by telling you a story about a farmer and someone who thought he was an expert, and it goes like this. A farmer was herding his flock in a remote pasture when suddenly a brand new BMW advanced towards him through a cloud of dust. The driver, a man in an expensive suit, leaned out the window and asked the farmer, "If I tell you exactly how many sheep you have in your flock, will you give me one?" The farmer looked at the man, then looked at his peacefully grazing flock and calmly answered, "Sure." The man got out of his car, whipped out his iPad, surfed to a page on the internet where he called up a GPS satellite navigation system, scanned the area, and then opened up a database and an Excel spreadsheet with complex formulas. He sent an email on his BlackBerry and after a few minutes received a response. Finally, he printed out a 130-page report on his miniaturised printer and turned to the farmer and very cockily said, "You have exactly 1,586 sheep." The man said, "That's correct. You can have one of my sheep," said the farmer. He watched as the man in the expensive suit selected one of the animals and bundled it into his car. Then the farmer said, "If I can tell you exactly what your business is, will you give me back my animal?" "Okay, why not?" answered the man. "Clearly," said the farmer, "you're a politician." "That's correct," said the politician. The politician answered, amazed. "But how did you guess that?" "No guessing required," answered the farmer. "You turned up here even though nobody called you. You want to get paid for solving a problem that didn't exist by answering a question I already knew the answer to, and you don't know crap about my business." He looked the politician in the eye and said, "Now, give me back my dog." So I can usually tell the difference between a sheep and a dog, except when it's dark. Now, this conference is timely because I believe the future of your sector, along with the future of manufacturing in our nation, is at a crossroads. The challenge of promoting the benefits of corrosion control measures to industry is becoming doubly challenging with a rising tide of imported steel fabrications, largely from China. These imports are cheaper than local products and often do not meet Australian standards for fabrication, welding strength or galvanising. Add to that a poorly applied corrosion coating or treatment and you have a perfect storm of additional through-life costs for reworking, repair and long-term maintenance. Sydney Harbour Bridge is a great example of both Australian achievement but also the cost of controlling corrosion. It's constantly being painted. Once one end is finished, the painting begins at the other end. It's a great lesson in designing and constructing with corrosion control in mind because the through-life costs can be literally never-ending. Your association has had increasing success in convincing companies of the long-term benefits of corrosion control, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence today of two leading South Australian companies at this conference, ASC and Santos, and let's hope we have 12, not 8 or 6 submarines built here locally. But today I'd like to focus on what I think is crucial for governments to do in this sector, and there's much that needs to be done. Firstly, governments like the private sector must recognise the long-term value of preventing avoidable corrosion in steel infrastructure in Australia. Corrosion damage is estimated to impose a cost between 3 and 5% of GDP each year. Of this amount, experts have estimated that about 25% would be avoidable through tried and true corrosion control measures. If you do the maths on that, for an advanced industrialised nation like Australia, that means up to $16 billion a year could be saved across the economy if corrosion control measures were widely adopted. To put that in perspective, it's about the same amount as the net revenue that could be raised through the much talked about, much controversial increase in the GST. So to make this a reality, governments should be mandating corrosion prevention theory and skills in education and training courses across the nation, because right now not enough is being done to equip our graduates with the knowledge they need. I suspect this is a result of narrow preoccupation with upfront costs and going with the cheapest option. So there's little demand for skills in minimising or even being aware of through life costs with corrosion. This has to change, and governments have a role in making that change. Secondly, governments have to increase compliance levels for Australian standards in relation to steel fabrications, including for corrosion coatings. Now, right now, many Australian standards are essentially voluntary, depending on specifications for a project, and that is not good enough. And I think some of you here might want to rename Standards Australia as Substandards Australia, given the work or the lack of work they do in this area. But if we are to be serious about tackling corrosion to achieve the productivity and savings that are possible, then it's time to make these standards compulsory or at least incentivised. It's a false economy to save some money in the build phase only to pay multiples of the savings down the track in through life costs. And what's the best way to ensure that? To ensure the quality of safety of imported products, make Australian standards mandatory with heavy penalties on importers who import substandard products. And some of you may know about the debate about boron in steel and the difficulties that has in terms of welds and the safety of that. After this conference, I will be sitting down with your association to draft amendments to the Australian standards for corrosion control that I will introduce into the Senate as a private senator's bill, and I believe I'll have a number of my colleagues that will support that. That will have the effect of triggering a full-scale Senate inquiry and debate on corrosion control that is long overdue. And with that inquiry, I'm convinced that it will lead to real change. Now, there's a third front to tackle on all this. Governments have to address the uneven playing field in the steel sector, which is driving many local manufacturers to the wall. Government procurement rules need to be changed to recognise the benefits of local procurement and the risks associated with overseas products that don't meet Australian standards. Australian manufacturing is facing a dangerous tipping point at the end of 2017. The exit of General Motors Holden, Ford and Toyota as car makers is expected to lead to the loss of up to 200,000 jobs, especially in South Australia and Victoria. It's about 150,000 in Victoria, 25,000 in South Australia, with another 25,000 through the rest of the country. The share of manufacturing in Australia's GDP has dropped from 12% to just under 7% in 10 short years. We're now bumping just a little above Botswana's 6%, but unless there is leadership and a sense of national urgency in reversing this decline, post-2017, I expect us to slide below Rwanda's 5%. And putting this in perspective, Germany's share of manufacturing as a percentage of GDP is 22%, because they get manufacturing, particularly advanced manufacturing. So getting the federal government to recognise the unfairness of its procurement policies is more than an argument about economics, it's about real jobs and skills around the country. Last month, I spoke at the annual conference of the Welding Technology Institute of Australia, an organisation which has joined with the Corrosion Association and other peak bodies such as the Australian Steel Institute to campaign for fairer procurement rules and for rigorous standards. I believe it's critical that your association works closely with the WTIA and the Australian Steel Institute to ensure imported steel products are not substandard and that we have procurement policies that give local manufacturers a fighting chance. Australia is not alone either in confronting huge challenges to national steel sectors. In the UK, Prime Minister David Cameron has recognised the risks of imported steel and steel fabrication. He knows what's at risk because just a few weeks ago, with 2 British steelmakers on the brink and in the face of a concerted opposition attack, he launched a plan to combat steel dumping imported from imports and boost government procurement of UK steel. but back home there is little recognition of the need to take real action. It's imperative the state and federal governments enact meaningful local procurement rules that treat you fairly. In Canberra, the Commonwealth Procurement Rules governs the government spending of $40 billion a year in supplies. And often the winning tender, is based on a value for money decision which only looks at narrow, short-term measures. The lowest price bidder that complies with the minimum requirements, which in your case may mean below par requirements in corrosion control. But we all know that any purchase made by government in Australia has benefits well beyond the company that is awarded the contract. The multiplier effect is enormous, as well as the tax revenue going back to the Treasury. And we know from the Royal Services Institute in the UK, the study they did a number of years ago for defence procurement alone, 40% of the money of defence procurement went back to the British government in taxes, and there'll be a similar figure here. So I'm working with my Senate colleague John Madigan working on a Buy Australian First local procurement bill. I want the Commonwealth to meaningfully recognise the broader economic benefits from using local products such as employment tax, whole-of-life project costs such as maintenance, and multiplier effects of job creation in Australia. And of course, that must include corrosion control as a key factor in any relevant procurement decisions. I wish you well at your conference today. The areas that you're covering are of critical importance to our manufacturing sector, to our economy, and to our future prosperity. And in a sense, your sector is a metaphor for the challenges facing the Australian economy and Australian manufacturing in particular. Because if we can't give corrosion control the national attention and action it deserves, together with the challenges Australian manufacturing faces, then large parts of this nation are in trouble. We have an obligation to do this, to do all in our power to prevent large parts of this nation, particularly in the southern states, turning into a rust belt. That's why this conference and your work is so important. All the best. Thanks very much.